Thank you for being here with us today. Welcome. How are you?
Hi, Guy. Pleasure to be here. Yeah, really good. Thank you. Start of spring. It's lovely.
Absolutely, yeah. It's a lovely sunny day here actually today. I got all the pressure washing done at the weekend, so I can see it all in beautiful splendour today with the clear skies. But no, Matt, lovely to have you here. Thanks very much for coming on to the show. I guess by way of introduction, Matt, you are a data leader. You're an entrepreneur. You've had a really interesting career journey to date. You've taken some really interesting roles with the likes of Elsevier, big blue chip companies, as kind of head of data and analytics. But you've also co-founded your own company as well and been the CTO of HiveMap. So really looking forward to today's episode and sort of hearing more about your journey and picking your brains today. As for the theme that we're going to cover, we thought we'd tackle the biggie, which is Chat GPT, and I guess not just Chat GPT, but large language models in general, and talk a little bit about the evolution of so-called AI. And yeah, I mean, I can honestly say, from my perspective, I don't think I can remember a time when a particular tool or product has had quite such a widespread recognition and such a swift adoption before in tech at all, really. But well, I guess not just in tech, but everywhere in the world. Yeah, I think every episode of the podcast we've done, every event we've done in some way, shape, and form has encompassed ChatGPT. So I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on it today. But before we delve into that and sort of talk about the that side of things, it'd be lovely just to hear a little bit more about you, your kind of background, and then we can go from there. So talk us through a little bit about who you are, your background, and I guess how you got into data and tech in the first place.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, Guy. Thanks for that lovely introduction. And yeah, super excited to be talking about ChatGPT later. Yeah, I think it's one of these revolutions, if you will, that's up there with the internet. One of these things that will change the fabric of society and the way we work. So yeah, happy to talk about that in a few minutes. But a bit of background of myself. So I've been working in data and AI in sort of some form or another for about 20 years. So quite a while. And most recently, I've as you said, I've built and led my own startup focusing on using AI to predict risks on construction projects. But prior to that, as you also pointed out, I worked for big blue chip Elsevier, doing a lot of stuff around network analytics. So taking large quantities of research literature, looking at who sites who, and building up these huge networks with literally tens of millions of nodes, as in tens of millions of articles and links between them, billions of links connect them all together. And a lot of what we were doing at Elsevier there was taking those networks and pulling out the structure embedded in those and using that to feed product intelligence or newsfeed content. I spent sort of 9 years prior to that working in climate science, so building sensor networks, designing them from sort of board level up and going out to lots of weird and wonderful places all around the world to install these sensor networks, then ensure the data was brought back and was analysed correctly, and statistical properties of that data could be extracted for improving climate models. And yes, my initial training was in electronics engineering, so I was very much a hardware monkey to get my career started, if you will.
Good stuff. Good stuff. So talk us through then from the hardware side, what took you into data, I guess in particular. What was that sort of segue for you?
Yeah. So I mean, it was a kind of logical extension of all of the sensor design and development, and my PhD was centered around building a sensor for measuring wind turbulence in 3 dimensions from a balloon. And once you've built the instrument and actually you're trying to analyze the data, and you've got this complex situation of the balloon that's moving in turbulence that you're trying to measure. You've got this really complicated process you're trying to pull out the actual turbulence measurements from. So for you to actually be able to generate any value from that, you've really got to delve into the algorithms, the machine learning, and the AI components that allow you to sort of pull out that signal from the noise, basically. And so it was a logical extension, sort of step away from the hardware and more into the sort of data side of things, so as to actually generate the sort of final product, the final insights.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I guess whether it's hardware, software, or anything, like say, ultimately the data is what gives you the insights as to whether it's moving in the right direction, I suppose, isn't it? And whether it's all working. So yeah, absolutely, makes sense as a logical progression. So yeah, what sort of initially attracted you to the world of technology? Because when I see people that sort of get all the way to that sort of the holy Shangri-La as a head of data, or as a CTO, people are always really interested to understand, was that just you a natural technician? Did you always kind of find that interesting, or what was the sort of initial thought process to get into the world of tech?
Yeah, and I guess it ties back to your question of how did you move into data from sort of hardware side of things. But as a kid, I always liked making things. There was a small cupboard. Actually, it was the front lobby of the house from the tiny ones, but it was a space full of cardboard boxes that would be stored for Matt to build things out of. So I was always building like castles or cars or some sort of crazy invention out of cardboard boxes as a kid. And being the fourth kid of four, there was always like a ton of Lego to play with. So I was always making things. And being the son of a financial bursar and a maths teacher meant that maths was always being thrown at me. Like kind of silly little maths problems in the car. What happens if you got 3 apples and you give 2 apples to Bob, and blah blah blah. So I was always having that sort of existence of maths and making things. And so when it came to going to university, it was, well, I'm going to go and be an engineer. And in the late 90s, as a teenager, I'd started to learn to play the guitar, and I got a real fascination in guitars, guitar amplifiers, and guitar effects pedals. So it seemed obvious to go and do electronics engineering. And it's kind of interesting because now, if you think back in the late 90s, you wanted to make something for a guitar. Yeah, you were going to have to pick up a soldering iron and actually solder something, get your head around all the electronic side of things. Now you probably just write some software for it, right? But back in the late 90s, there's no way you could have got a computer to do the sort of things that kids can now get computers to do. So the calling was very much towards electronics, electronic engineering. How can you make a valve amplifier or a great widget to add some effect on the guitar sort of sound? And from there, obviously, the world has evolved through hardware, through to actually building a lot of tech out of software. And we've already talked a little about the evolution from moving into more data analytics as well. But yeah, I think probably I was always going to end up building things in my life, and the way society and the way tech has evolved means that I've gravitated towards data and software, and here I am.
There we go. Absolutely. Well, I always love a little segue into technology from the world of guitars. I mean, that's probably the coolest segue into technology I think I've ever heard. But yeah,
very, very rock and roll.
absolutely. Yeah, we talk into a man after my own heart, because obviously I'm big into my guitars, and I'm sure we can probably take a whole other episode up on talking about that, but maybe not for today.
Look forward to that one.
But no, I think it's a really great point, and I mean, you're dead right, and I guess it sort of leads into a little bit what we're going to talk about today is the main topic. But the speed at which technology and sort of data and dare I say the word AI, is sort of progressing at the moment is just exponentially quickly. Even in the last sort of 2-3 years, it feels like it's sort of really coming on. But what are you now most passionate about in the world of data? From your career to date, and sort of seeing how things have evolved. What's sort of the where that sits for you now in terms of your passions?
Yeah, so I still have a real love for graphs. I talked earlier about networks, social networks, and those citation networks that we worked on at Elsevier. And I think networks are kind of are fascinating. You know, most of the world we live in follows like a one-dimensional thread. If you read a document, you start at the top and you read down the bottom. It's one-dimensional all the way, right? But the world doesn't work in one dimensions. You know, it works in multiple dimensions. You know, in three-dimensional space, it's obviously three dimensions, but actually it goes beyond that, and we think about all the different facets of things that are going on in sort of an n-dimensional sort of activity space, and graphs represent that sort of n-dimensional activity space. And in my mind, once we can encapsulate the things we know into these sort of networks, these sort of graph-like structures, we build up these knowledge graphs, that to me will underpin the next step in AI. And so as a consequence, you know, I am fascinated at looking at how graph deep learning is evolving.
Absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, just from a general understanding of how we capture knowledge and apply that by way of, you know, call it intelligence or whatever you want, you know, graph, yeah, it seems like a very exciting and kind of sensible way forward. And I guess that probably leads us on to a little bit, let's talk a little bit about ChatGPT then as a tool. And I think you quite rightly made the point earlier on. You know, I often hear the word sort of watershed moment when people talk about ChatGPT. But as we all know, it's not the only large language model out there, and you know, obviously these things have been sort of being cooked up for a wee while. But it'd be good to break it down. I suppose it sounds like you've got a very good understanding of the different innate models being used and different algorithms used within you know, tools like ChatGPT. So it'd be good to sort of break it down into the nuts and bolts of, you know, first and foremost, you know, what is a large language model, and you know, kind of why do you feel that ChatGPT is now, as I say, being dubbed this watershed moment for us all?
Yeah. Okay. So I think the first thing to say is, I mean, yeah, it's huge. Well, you know, it is game changing. What has come to out in the public discourse over the last few months. However, it started, this whole revolution, if you will, probably started arguably back end of 2018, but arguably even before that, back in 2013. And I think if we want to get our heads around what a large language model is, we need to sort of take a bit of a step back and look more generally as to what artificial intelligence is actually doing. And you know, throughout all the complexity that AI seems to be, it's not really complex at all. It's just pattern recognition. It's just looking for repeated patterns that it can see throughout a load of data. And when I say that the current revolution can be taken back to 2013, we take it back to some research that was done by the guys at Google, where they were trying to predict the probability of different words co-occurring in the same sentences, right? And they managed to get to a point where they could predict whether words would appear in the right sentence or not, and they were accurate, like maybe sort of 2/3 of the time, 66 roughly. That's sort of 66% of the time they were accurate. And yeah, that was a kind of step forward on the state of the art at the time, but in itself wasn't very revolutionary. What was revolutionary though is the method they used to actually get there meant that they could create or translate each word they were looking into a coordinate frame, just like we look at a three-dimensional space. They could translate those words into a coordinate set where those coordinates actually translated real meaning. And so the example that the Google researchers gave was that if you took the coordinate associated with the word man and subtracted that from the coordinate associated with the word king, and then added the coordinate associated with the word woman, you got to the word queen. So, you know, semantically what we're saying is king minus man plus woman is a queen. And this logically makes sense to us from what these words actually mean, right? And so that was back in 2013. So that was the revolutionary piece back then. And you know, there's been various advances done on top of that, whether if you take more of the sentence to add context to what that word means, and then use similar sort of algorithms to predict sequences from sequences. So, for instance, how you can use that process to actually translate from English to French, or how you can use that process to take a long sequence of text and convert it to a short sequence of text, i.e., text summarization. You could build up these models, and actually what's happened, and that's exactly what they've done in building out large language models. They've taken that whole process, thrown an awful lot of data at the algorithm, trained it for a number of days/weeks, and you've got this brilliant representation of the semantic meaning of words. And that's essentially what a large language model is.
Sure.
Oh, poor, sorry.
Sure. No, I think it's a good point, and I think, you know, it's just ChatGPT. I think the phenomenon of it and how it's kind of broken onto the scene and why it's being dubbed this sort of watershed moment. I mean, obviously, it isn't the first large language model that's come about. You know, it's not the first kind of comprehensive chatbot, and you know, OpenAI aren't the only business that have done it. But I think the real differentiation of, you know, kind of the difference between what do we have, like there's BlenderBot from Meta, and then Tay from Microsoft, and sort of other chatbots obviously existed before, which didn't quite have the same level of adoption. But I think the key differentiation that I can discern with, you know, with what OpenAI have done is that it's actually publicly available. This is the first time that they've made a public tool. You know, I think that's why it's kind of blown people's mind, because you can actually engage with it and interact with it. And for the first time as average Joe blogs, you know, you kind of got access to this kind of you know, AI tool, so to speak. So it's an interesting model, obviously, that OpenAI have gone with. And yeah, I totally agree with you. You know, ultimately, it's not a uniquely capable form of intelligence. It's essentially just pattern recognition of, you know, of data that's being fed to it, and as such, you know, there'll always be you know, limitations for this type of tool, you know, this type of sort of algorithm, I guess. So what do you foresee as, you know, as incredible as it is, and as kind of, you know, mind-bending sometimes with some of the insights it sort of comes out with, what do you perceive as some of the limitations of, you know, like a chat GPT?
Yeah. So, I mean, going back to this whole pattern recognition thing, for it to be a pattern, there's got to be something that's occurring with a trend, right? So it's never going to come out with some outlier, because the outlier is not the pattern. The trend is the pattern. So what an AI is going to do, it's going to converge to the mean. And so it's always going to produce the average. It's going to produce the kind of the run-of-the-mill, the expected outcome. And so therefore its limitation is actually in spotting the unlikely yet correct outcome. So, you know, if there is no trend, but it actually could potentially be an answer to a particular problem, it's not going to spot that, because it's not found that as the most likely probable outcome of a particular question that's been thrown at it.
I see. And what do you foresee? How do we overcome that, I guess, and how do we take this sort of, or understand the limitations that exist now, and actually work with that to evolve it into, yeah, more of a sentient intelligence?
So I guess two answers, right? A lot of people will be saying we just need to throw more data at it. Surely it's just going to get better over more time as we throw more and more data at it. But you've probably heard recently that I think Sam Altman at OpenAI said that they weren't going to put more data in it. I think we can conclude that actually we've reached a saturation point where, yeah, you might throw a bit more data at it and you might get 10% improvement, but you're not going to get the revolutionary step change that we've seen over the last few years of using these algorithms. And the reason for that is we've already managed to eke out the sort of the trends in the data. And you could say, if you just throw more data at it, what you're doing is giving more context, and you can give it more context to break down different scenarios to sort of get more understanding under those different contexts. But at some point, you run out of the volume of data to actually formulate a decent trend prediction, right? So at some point, that doesn't actually work. So to answer your question, what do I actually think is the solution to that? Well, this is coming back to why I'm excited about knowledge graphs, because in my mind, you can't keep throwing loads of data at this problem unless you've got a framework to say, actually, I don't need to explore every possible avenue. I just need to explore the realistic avenues based on my understanding of the problem.
Mm-hmm.
It's a bit like if you were to throw a ball up in the air, you're not looking left and right to see if the ball is going to come and hit you in the face. You're looking up because you know gravity is at play and it's going to come straight back down. You have a knowledge graph in your head that
Yeah.
you've built from your experience of the world that tells you that ball is going to come down, not left or right.
Mm.
So don't bother exploring left or right because it's not coming from there. Right?
Yeah.
And similarly, we can build that sort of that knowledge representation, and to some extent, it is built in, but it's not explicit in models like ChatGPT. If we can explicitly define what these knowledge constraints are, we can make better sense of the data that we are throwing at it.
Interesting. So do you feel then that the kind of big step forward that we're all kind of very excited about or either dreading in equal measure of getting some form of AGI, some kind of like sentient intelligence? Do you feel the model actually best to achieve that is actually going to be pursuing knowledge graphs?
I do, and the AGI sort of excitement slash fear. It's a point of debate amongst experts. My personal view is that we are decades away from it because we don't have yet the machinery to connect these different pieces together. So we've been talking about large language models. We could also talk about a lot of the great work that's been going on in computer vision. We could talk about some of the great work in terms of the Boston Dynamics sort of moving robots that we've seen heavily publicized. We could talk about self-driving cars, but they're all brilliant advances, but in isolated spaces. There's no overarching connecting piece that connects all these different things together. So as it currently stands, we're not going to be able to suddenly step towards an AGI because they're all isolated language or isolated vision or isolated motion. We haven't got that sort of overarching technology that brings all this stuff together. So that's why I think we're decades away from an AGI. Potentially, knowledge graphs might provide that framework, but we're still some time away from being able to get to that point where knowledge graphs can be leveraged in such a way and we can move towards an AGI. And that's why I think we're decades away.
Yeah, fair enough. Do you know, it's still quite surreal to think though, Matt, that we're only, you think about the timeline of man and actually, the exponential leaps forward that we've all seen in the last few years, to sit here and say that we're actually only decades away from some form of AGI, it's pretty scary, isn't it, in itself? And it's, I say, exciting and scary in equal measure because a few decades in the timeline of man is literally a blink of an eye, and and this is why I'm genuinely impressed by tools, like the AI tools and how they've advanced, because obviously the level of computational power that we have now and like I say, the output that we can get from these models is just unbelievably crazy. But if we can work out a way, like say, to tie those together and build in the context, I guess, then that's when it's going to become particularly exciting. And say only a few decades away, that's nothing really, is it?
Yeah, no, definitely, and if you look at where we've come with the silicon chip over a handful of decades, right? That has changed our world as our parents have understood it, right? So yeah, absolutely, things are moving at an alarming rate. And decades is, it's basically tomorrow. But the bigger range of risks that I think artificial intelligence poses across that bigger range of risks, AGI is probably the least of our concerns. We probably ought to be thinking about some other things that are more immediate and will have impact to us sooner. We shouldn't obviously ignore the AGI future. We should be planning for that and thinking how we maintain, how we create a controlled state, and how we can create a safe society. So how we can create a safe sort of society, but there are bigger, more immediate problems to deal with.
You've piqued my interest. Go on.
So, I mean, the obvious point here is that we've talked about AI being a convergence to the mean. We've talked about AI's ability to generate something that's very average, but what works. So as a consequence, if you're in a role doing something that is valuable but average, and you're just repeatedly producing the same sort of material, the same sort of thing day in, day out, chances are AI is going to take over your work. And we've seen that from all different walks of life, from people writing content through something like a large language model to software engineers writing code. So it's going to hit a lot of different areas of society. And as a consequence of that, as humans, we need to be pushing our edge ourselves towards that sort of that top of the class, that A-star level of performance, because that's what AI cannot do. And we need to be able to push ourselves to that thing that's connecting different contexts together, because also AI cannot do that. So we have a challenge as to how do we make people aware that they've got to push that A-star, they've got to be able to do that thing that AI cannot do. And for that, they need to understand what the AI cannot do. And for those people that are going to be 100% displaced by this sort of technology, how do we help them learn new technologies and new skills so that they're still capable of earning money in a capitalist society?
Yeah,
we have a huge problem with the displacement of employees, right?
Absolutely. It's it is certainly the people I've spoken to, I guess, that sit outside of tech. When you have the conversation with them about, I've definitely had that light bulb moment with a few people I've spoken to, and they've not really heard of ChatGPT necessarily, and it explains to them what it is, and then you give them a demo and that's it. And you can kind of almost see the look of terror in their eyes about actually what's that going to mean for certainly in industries like the legal sector and things like that. For what is essentially, in my opinion, an industry that needed a lot of disruption anyway. But in terms of actually what it means and what it's capable of doing, it is absolutely going to totally turn it on its head. And these are obviously very bright, intelligent people we're talking about here in terms of solicitors and lawyers and people that are probably actually almost the kind of most immediate threat to their industry. So yeah, I totally agree with you that it's about how do we engage with it and how do we utilize it from here. One of the things actually I'm kind of always very reassured of with recruitment, because it's as an industry, it's definitely been, well, let's face it, recruitment's got a bit of a stigma. People often think that all recruiters will sell their grandma down the river to kind of get the next deal. And obviously I enjoy bucking the trend and, sort of not necessarily being that kind of recruiter, but obviously try and conduct myself with a little bit more ethics and morals and that kind of thing. But fundamentally, people have been trying to replace recruitment with a piece of software for a good long while, and I'm sure a lot of people will be very happy if that does happen. But I am kind of reassured, sort of deep down, there's certain industries out there, and I do think recruitment is possibly one of those, that it is really at its core innately about human nature. It's a very, very difficult thing to fully replicate with AI, and I'm sure we'll talk about this in a moment, but we definitely use it. We use it a lot. We've found a number of different really interesting use cases where ChatGPT has kind of really accentuated and sort of augmented our service. But I do believe it's going to be very difficult to fully replace it, because ultimately when a client is working with us, what they're paying for at the end of the day is our opinion. Like when we're sat opposite somebody having a coffee or having a beer, do we understand the culture of that company? Do we understand the personality of that individual? And we're making a judgment call on whether we feel somebody, gut feel really it's going to be a good fit. Of course they've got to be able to do the job, of course they've got to have the right technical skills, but at its core, fundamentally, it's people are paying for our opinion on that particular person. And like you said, we may be decades away, but it does feel like we're going to be a long, long way away before we can actually get that level of kind of both objective and subjective evaluation, sort of in equal measure. So I hope that a lot of other people sort of look at it in a way that, they sort of think, right, well, how can I upskill? How can I sort of use these tools in a certain way to continue to solve problems with the skill sets that I have? Because let's face it, that's what business is at the end of the day, isn't it? It's like working out what problems need to be solved and working out how you can solve them. But what do you feel for the world of engineers? Because that must also be quite a scary place to be if you're a software engineer now who's spent the last 15 years learning all of the different syntax for different languages and stuff, and now all of a sudden ChatGPT comes along and writes the most clean sort of perfect code instantaneously. What do you feel it kind of means for?
Yeah. So I think I think you hit the nail on the head there, actually, in terms of recruitment and actually that human component. And I think you can often consider the value being in the sort of the the short tail, if you will. So it's easy for an AI to serve a large quantity of people, but it's very hard for an AI to serve that kind of high value for specific individuals. And in the case of recruitment, where you're trying to look for a specific role for a specific person, that's kind of that short tail sort of sort of thinking. And so you don't have that long trend to go and play with. You're looking for that nuance, right? And that's where I think the real value comes in. So if you are a software engineer, if you're writing some sort of run-of-the-mill sort of code that's kind of just a bit tedious to write anyway, frankly, there's going to be enough examples on the internet for a large language model to generate that code for you. Where the value comes in is where you're doing something kind of a little bit clever, and maybe that thing that's a little bit clever will be tied to the product application or a particular use case that you have in mind. So my advice to software engineers would be: get close to product, get close to your users, understand what it is that you can do to generate a real love for your product, and make sure you code towards that. And the actual process of actually writing code, let the AI do it. It's going to do it quicker than you, but it's never going to be able to generate that sort of short tail value.
Yeah, yeah, totally agree. And I think it will be a really interesting sort of journey or thing to keep close eyes on kind of which industries out there do ultimately unfortunately fall by the wayside because of the evolution in AI, but those, like say, that also kind of really rise to the challenge of how they can actually use it to evolve their service and accentuate things in a different way. So yeah, it's a definitely very fluid time and exciting time for all of us. But other than the kind of immediate threat of unfortunately certain redundancies being made in certain posts, what other sort of downsides do you see to the evolution of AI in general? It doesn't necessarily have to be kind of large language models, but other areas of AI such as deep fakes, these kind of areas. What do you kind of perceive as some of the downsides there?
Yeah, so I guess relatively recent news of Geoffrey Hinton leaving Google, actually, and reading some of his tweets with regards to his reasons for departure. I share a lot of his concerns around it being used, AI being used by bad actors around the world, being used for disinformation, being used by militaries against sort of our militaries, if you will. Yeah, it's a cause for concern. And there's a good parallel, I think, here between the scientists who developed AI and the scientists who developed the atomic bomb. I mean, it is revolutionary from a kind of warfare perspective. But yeah, so Geoffrey Hinton's sort of resignation is kind of really raised some really interesting points around this technology being used by bad actors for disinformation purposes, and of course the concern around data bias as well, and the fact that AI is going to reflect all those biases that we have in our data. But I had a week ago, I had a bit of a sort of penny drop moment for me with regards to Web3 and NFTs, and I wonder a little bit whether the world of disinformation and AI could be, if you will, the iPhone to 3G telephony. And what I mean by that is kind of 3G telephony was sold for ages as being like, oh, it's going to ground this new future. But there wasn't really any technology that could really leverage the bandwidth that 3G gave. And then the iPhone came along, and suddenly it was like, oh wow, we can watch things on this little screen in our pockets. And suddenly that revolutionized the value in that 3G telephony. Now, in the same way, I think NFTs and blockchain have been around for ages. Have been obviously been used for cryptocurrencies, and there's been a lot of talk for a while as to how you can embed smart contracts on the blockchain. And NFTs have been obviously used to create a sense of ownership of digital art, but actually, I really think there's a lot of power in actually using NFTs and blockchains to create a sort of a provenance, such that actually if you see a picture or you see a bit of text, you can actually use the NFT and the blockchain to trace it back to, Guy Bevington wrote this, or Matt Hobby took this picture, and actually you can create that provenance, and that's going to be hugely important. It doesn't solve the disinformation problem, but it does give you a sense of, I can have faith in this thing I'm looking at through the NFT and blockchain process.
Yeah, absolutely. There's obviously lots of different ways of looking at it, isn't there? And yeah, I totally agree with you. Disinformation. When I first saw a really convincing deep fake video, I was like shaken to the core about this. This is seriously dangerous, and because obviously disinformation, you've only got to go onto Facebook to kind of see it quite readily occurring in all of our lives. And thankfully we're getting a little bit better in terms of developing some of the kind of natural filters around disinformation, but when you think about the power essentially is in controlling the masses, and for a lot of people out there in the world that are being subject to this kind of spread of disinformation, are they necessarily going to be able to discern between, does it have the right sort of provenance, like you say, is it a genuine message or not? And unfortunately, majority of people probably out there in the world won't have access to that. So obviously there is a real kind of concern and risk there, I guess, about how these processes can be used in a very threatening way. But I also agree with you that there's, and I do think blockchain kind of did the whole decentralization element of things and being able to track things back. I think I do think it's the kind of the future and the way forward. And I guess as humans, there's always been threats to our existence. There's always been tools that could either be used in a very positive or a very negative way, and we've just got to make sure that the goodies essentially outweigh the baddies, and we sort of work out a way to solve the disinformation problem as best we can. But like I said, it is exciting to think about things like whole blockchain and NFTs and things like that are great examples of actually that could be a really sensible way of doing that. So yeah, it's interesting times. What are your thoughts on the recent, talking about the ethical side of things, and like you say, the no plans to kind of continue to train the model? What are your thoughts on this sort of 6-month moratorium that OpenAI have called on sort of continuing to train ChatGPT 4 after this?
Yeah, I'm sorry to say, I think it's incredibly naive. Let's imagine you, I, and all of our friends said, let's stop doing research into AI. There's a lot of bad actors out there in the world that are not going to stop engaging in research in AI. So if we were to have a moratorium, we would just be left behind. So it's a naive approach. The point that the sort of meta point they're making is, look, let's put some checks and balances in. Let's start having a public discourse on this. Absolutely, 100% agree. And part of this podcast, or this podcast is part of that discourse, right? Let's start engaging as a society around this technology and the risks and dangers. But to simply just say let's down tools and do nothing more on it until we've got a handle, that's just daft and naive. I'm sorry.
I agree. I definitely agree. I think it feels like it's come from a purely emotional place of probably wanting to get ahead of the curve, and before too many people kind of revolt, I guess, with this thing that's not. I think it probably boils down to the fact there's this thing that not many people necessarily have understood, and then they've come across and seen it, and it's kind of just sent a lot of ripples throughout the world in many different ways, hasn't it? So I kind of see it as a bit of a temporary hiatus that is more a precautionary measure than anything else. But I do also agree with you that it does seem quite naive to it's not really going to solve much of a of an ongoing problem, is it? So yeah. So what I guess in a nutshell to kind of wrap things up from where we are now, to get to that next watershed moment from this point onwards, what do you think is gonna drive the next revolution, let's say, in the world of AI?
Yeah, so I still hold a flame for the sort of semantic web thinking, which is something that was being peddled around for decades now by the likes of Sir Tim Berners-Lee, and creating this sort of representation of the world around us and the facts within it, and how those facts evolve with each other to build up some sort of public knowledge graph that can be used for training other AIs. I think is going to be the work that creates that sort of next step change.
Hmm. Interesting, absolutely. So you think it's sort of a public knowledge graph insofar as a similar kind of model to a chat GPT that's readily accessible to the public, but one that is created by a single entity, or one that's sort of contributed to by multiple different entities?
Yeah, I can't see how it would come to be some sort of purely publicly owned model. I mean, in the same way that I think OpenAI started out as being a kind of let's create open AI models for everyone to use, but ultimately they've sort of come up against the kind of how do you fund that sort of open model, and Microsoft obviously now have a big stake in it, and as a consequence, Open AI are not as open as they once were, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I struggle to see how we're going to create like a purely publicly owned knowledge graph, but I do see as having a number of reliable knowledge sources in the same way we rely on things like the BBC as being a kind of a good source of relatively unbiased data. Yeah, so I see as having a number of institutions that build their reputation on the fact that they are objective, and objective through the processing of the data that they have access to.
Yeah. Just listening to you speak, then I think something occurred to me. I think that there's probably no better, more kind of obvious application of branding than in the world of AI moving forward. If you're a business now that is obviously building any tool specifically related to branding, related to AI, getting your branding kind of totally crystal clear, and your messaging kind of on point, from an ethical standpoint and a value standpoint and a mission standpoint, I guess is going to be absolutely vital for a lot of companies, whether they're going to succeed or not, because fundamentally, like you say, it just boils down to trust, doesn't it? You do feel that when you're reading an article from the BBC, there is an element, okay, I haven't necessarily always been cleaner than whiter than white, but there is that element of trust there, and underlying layer of trust that you kind of do take that information on board. And I think that's the a little bit within the world of AI at the moment. It feels a little bit like the Wild West of everybody sort of trying to rush to the hills to go and claim the chunk of gold, but it's like who actually trusts what at the moment. And I think that's going to be a big problem for a lot of companies to solve moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And the more we can use technology to support that trust network, the better, as far as I see.
Absolutely. Okay, super. Well, Matt, really enjoyed the conversation. I think you've definitely helped add a lot of clarity to where we are at the moment, and kind of dispelled a few myths, but also shared, I think, some really interesting insights about where we're headed. And I definitely agree with you. It's a very exciting space. I'm also very keen to understand how knowledge graphs will continue to evolve and sort of start linking together a lot of these very powerful models that we have in play today. I guess let's sort of watch this space. But I like to end all podcasts, as you may know by now, with asking all guests a closing question of, as a technologist, as a leader, what would you say is the one best piece of advice that you've ever received?
That I've ever received probably comes down to focus on your users, focus on your products, focus on a North Star metric. So, yeah, a lot of the stuff that's taught out of YC startup school, but you really build that understanding of what makes your user happy, and find a metric that reflects that, and go after that 110%.
Nice. Very. You can tell that came from a data leader, because a lot of people will talk about find out what makes your user happy. Absolutely, but then the point you had of being able to find a metric to measure it, that's the key thing. Cool.
Yeah, if you can't measure it, how do you know you're delivering it? So yeah.
Absolutely right. Awesome. Well, look, nothing else remains but for me to say thank you very much for coming on. Really enjoyed the chat, and yeah, let's get together again and record another one in future. I guess once the next watershed moment comes along, which probably won't be too long, and dare I say we can probably throw a little bit in there about our guitars as well. So yeah, thanks for coming on, Matt. Lovely to speak to you, and yeah, let's catch up again very soon.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me, Guy. Cheers.